Every time you receive money, you have 2 seconds before deciding what to do with it. 2 seconds. Hidden inside that tiny instant lies the difference between people who one day gain freedom and those who spend their whole lives trapped. But the real answer is far stranger than you think. It has nothing to do with how much you earn. It has everything to do with what your brain does with every coin that passes through your hands. Sofia was 14 years old, and she had never thought of money as something that could be learned. To her, money arrived and disappeared, like water falling from an open faucet. Her weekly allowance lasted, at most, 2 days. The rest of the time, she simply waited for the next one, the way someone waits for the tide to come in. Has it ever happened to you that money disappears and you don't know where it went? That happened to Sofia every single week. She'd buy something small here, something small there. Never big purchases. Tiny, almost invisible decisions that piled up without her noticing. A soda, a snack, a bracelet she saw in a store and forgot about 3 days later. Her grandfather, a man who had lived through hard times, watched this in silence. One day, he invited her to sit on the porch and showed her something she had never seen before. An old metal box full of antique coins. Each one of these coins, he told her, represents a decision I made many years ago. Sofia didn't understand at first, but her grandfather kept going. Psychologist Bridget Madrian, a researcher known for her studies on financial behavior, discovered something revealing in her research on saving. People don't save mainly because they earn more or less money. They save because they build automatic systems that act before temptation has time to appear. In other words, saving doesn't depend on willpower. It depends on the design of your habits. This sounds simple, but it completely changes how you should think about your money. Your brain, whether you like it or not, is wired to prefer an immediate reward over a future one. Scientists call this temporal discounting. It's the exact reason a piece of candy today feels better than the promise of something bigger tomorrow. Your ancient mind, shaped over thousands of years of scarcity, wasn't built to think in long time frames. It was built to survive the present. Why do you think it's so hard to resist spending the moment you have money in your hand? That's why saving is so difficult. It's not that you're weak. It's that your brain is fighting against millions of years of instinct. Sofia's grandfather explained his system, one he had learned as a young man after going through financial hardship he never wanted to repeat. Every time he received money, he set aside a portion before spending the rest. Not afterward, before. He physically separated it, placed it somewhere else, far from his sight and his temptation. This lines up with what economist Richard Thaler, who won the Nobel Prize for his studies on economic behavior, called choice architecture. Thaler showed that people save far more when saving happens automatically, before they have the chance to decide to spend. Not because they're more disciplined, but because it removes the opportunity to fail. Sofia began to understand. The problem wasn't how much money she had. The problem was the moment she made the decision, she decided to try it. The next time she received her allowance, she immediately set aside a small portion before the temptation to spend it could appear. It wasn't much, barely 1 coin out of every 10 she received. But she did it before she could think twice. The first week, she barely noticed. The second week, neither. But by the 4th week, she looked at the small box where she kept that set-aside money and felt something she didn't expect. A sense of control. Did you know that simply watching savings grow, even a small amount, activates a sense of achievement in your brain? Neuroscientist Brian Knutson, in his research on the brain's reward system, found that anticipating a future gain activates the same brain regions as immediate pleasure. This means that once you train your mind to value saving, it starts to feel as satisfying as spending. Not right away, but over time, yes. Sofia kept up her small habit, set aside before spending. Over and over, week after week. At first, her friends laughed a little. Why save something so small? It wouldn't change anything important. But Sofia started to notice something curious. While her friends ended up with nothing at the end of each week, she had, little by little, a small reserve that kept growing. Months passed. What had started as a few set-aside coins turned into something more solid. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough that when an unexpected opportunity came up, a school trip her friends couldn't afford, Sofia was able to say yes without asking anyone for anything. On the day of the trip, as she boarded the bus, one of her friends asked her how she'd managed to pay for it on her own. Sofia couldn't explain it in a single sentence. It wasn't a stroke of luck. It wasn't an unexpected gift. It was simply one coin set aside every week, for months, without anyone really noticing. That night, back from the trip, Sofia sat on the porch with her grandfather again. She told him every detail: the scenery, the laughter, the strange feeling of having paid for something important with invisible effort that no one else had watched grow. Her grandfather smiled, opened his old box of coins again, and for the first time explained why he had never spent them, even though he could have many times over the years. "I don't keep them for their value today," he told her. "I keep them because they remind me that I once decided to be different, and that decision, repeated thousands of times, ended up being stronger than any hardship I faced afterward." That day, she finally understood what her grandfather had been trying to teach her from the start. The real change hadn't been the money itself. It had been the repeated decision, week after week, to set aside before spending. But there's something else in this story worth explaining, because it wasn't all as simple as it seems. There were weeks when Sofia felt the temptation to break her own system. Once a friend invited her to a birthday party and she needed to buy a gift. The money she'd set aside seemed like the easiest solution. Just this once, she thought, just for this occasion. It was her grandfather who reminded her of something important that afternoon. He told her that the money she'd set aside wasn't an emergency fund for impulses disguised as needs. It was a commitment to the person she was becoming. If she broke the rule once, the next exception would be easier to justify. And the next. Until the entire system collapsed, like a wall losing one brick at a time. How many times has a single exception turned, without you noticing, into a habit? Sofia decided instead to solve the gift problem a different way. Instead of touching her savings, she offered to make something with her own hands, a woven bracelet using thread she already had at home. It took longer than buying something at a store, but she didn't break her system. And she discovered, almost without expecting it, that a gift made with effort meant more to her friend than anything bought in a rush. That small moment taught her something no finance book could have explained as well: that protecting a habit sometimes requires creativity, not just discipline. Economist Daniel Kahneman, known for his studies on how people make decisions, described this kind of choice as a constant conflict between two systems of thinking. One is fast, impulsive, ruled by immediate desire. The other is slow, reflective, capable of looking toward the future. Every time Sofia chose to set aside before spending, she was strengthening that second system. And every time that system won, it grew a little stronger for the next battle. The research of behavioral economist Dan Ariely reinforces this same idea. Ariely showed that people drastically underestimate the power of small, consistent financial habits while overestimating the impact of large, isolated decisions. In other words, you don't need a big stroke of luck. You need small, repeated decisions that, over time, build up like invisible layers. How many times have you waited for a big change instead of starting with a small one? It's an uncomfortable question, because most people wait for the perfect moment, the bigger paycheck, the ideal opportunity, before they start building good habits. But that moment almost never comes. What does come every single day are small decisions: set aside or don't, spend or wait. One coin at a time. Sofia's grandfather kept that old metal box, not because the coins were worth much today. He kept them because each one represented a version of himself who decided in a difficult moment to build something different for his future. Sofia, without realizing it, had started building her own box. Years later, when Sofia was a young adult about to live on her own, she discovered something that surprised her. Many of her old classmates, people who had earned as much or more money than her in their first jobs, were still living week to week, exactly the way she used to before that afternoon on the porch with her grandfather. The income had changed, the habit hadn't. This lines up with one of the most cited findings in modern financial research. Economist Thomas Stanley, author of extensive studies on people who accumulated wealth, found that most people who achieve long-term financial stability aren't defined by extraordinary income, but by moderate spending habits sustained over years. In other words, it wasn't the size of the paycheck that set Sofia apart from her classmates. It was the quiet repetition of a single decision, week after week, for years. Sofia didn't become wealthy overnight, But she did become someone who never again felt that empty feeling at the end of the week, that uncomfortable question of where all the money had gone. She knew exactly where every part of it went. And above all, she knew that one part was always protected before temptation ever had the chance to touch it. Today, when you receive money, you have those same 2 seconds. You can let immediate temptation decide for you, the way Sofia did for years. Or you can set a part aside before you even think about it and let that small decision quietly work in your favor, week after week, until it becomes something you can't even see yet. The difference between two people with the same income, 20 years apart, is almost never about how much they earned. It's about what they did without overthinking it in those 2 seconds, every time, one coin at a time.